The morning fog hung thick over northern France as Luftwaffe pilots prepared for another day of combat, coffee cups steaming in the cold April air, mechanics making final checks on sleek Focke-Wulf fighters. In exactly 47 minutes, this routine morning would become the day that changed everything. The American fighters approaching from England looked like easy prey, fat, ungainly machines that violated every principle of fighter design. What appeared to be a gift from incompetent American designers would reveal a weapon that would systematically destroy German air superiority. This is the story of how German laughter turned to terror in 48 hours and how the ugliest fighter in the sky became the weapon that ruled it. April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above Rouen, France. Hauptmann Egon Mayer, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter aces with 63 confirmed kills, watched through his canopy as the American formation approached. 16 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, making their first deep penetration mission over occupied Europe. Even at this distance, their ungainly shape was unmistakable. Massive radial engines, barrel-shaped fuselages, wings that looked too small for their enormous bodies. Mayer keyed his radio to his wingmen in Jagdgeschwader 2, Fighter Wing 2. "Look what the Americans have sent us, flying milk bottles, fat targets pretending to be fighters." Laughter crackled across the radio frequency. The other German pilots could see them too, 16 of the most ungainly fighter aircraft anyone had ever seen, lumbering through the sky at what appeared to be laborious speed. They looked less like fighters and more like airborne tractors. Mayer's formation, 12 Focke-Wulf 190s, positioned for the attack. Standard doctrine, climbing to attack from above, where the Americans would be at maximum disadvantage. The FW-190s were the Luftwaffe's finest fighters, nimble, heavily armed, fast. Against these corpulent American machines, the engagement should be a slaughter. What Mayer didn't know, what none of the Luftwaffe pilots circling above the American formation knew, was that they were witnessing the combat debut of the weapon that would systematically destroy German fighter superiority in Western Europe. That within 48 hours, the Thunderbolt would demonstrate capabilities that would force complete revision of Luftwaffe tactical doctrine. That the fat, ungainly milk bottles would prove to be the most survivable, most destructive fighter-bomber combination the Allies would field. In 48 hours, German pilots who had laughed at the P-47's appearance would be filing combat reports describing a fighter that could absorb punishment, that would destroy 3 Messerschmitts and still fight effectively. In 48 hours, Luftwaffe intelligence would be urgently reassessing American fighter capabilities, warning that the new fighter represented a serious threat, despite its appearance. In 48 hours, Egon Mayer would be dead, shot down by a P-47 on March 2, 1944, his 102 victories ending when 8 50 caliber machine guns converged on his aircraft and literally tore it apart. But on April 8, 1943, at 27,000 feet over France, Mayer was confident. He had fought Spitfires, Hurricanes, Soviet fighters. He understood air combat intimately. The American fighters below him violated every principle of fighter design he knew. They would be easy kills. He would learn differently in approximately 7 minutes. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had emerged from panic in June 1940 as France fell and German fighters swept across Europe, demonstrating tactical superiority. American aircraft designers realized with horror that every fighter in American inventory was obsolete. The Army Air Corps needed a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching, preferably exceeding, German fighter performance. They needed it immediately. Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's brilliant Georgian-born chief designer, had studied the problem and reached a radical conclusion. You couldn't build a fighter that matched German fighters using German design philosophy. German fighters were lightweight, with inline liquid-cooled engines, designed for agility and climb rate. To beat them, you needed something completely different. Kartveli's design was audacious, a massive radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney 2800 Double Wasp producing 2,000 horsepower, a turbo supercharger system that would maintain full power at altitudes where German fighters gasped for air, 8 50 caliber machine guns, more firepower than any fighter in service, and enough armor plating and structural strength to survive battle damage that would destroy conventional fighters. The result was a monster. The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941, weighed 9,900 pounds empty, 65% more than its predecessor. Fully loaded for combat, it weighed over 17,000 pounds, more than some medium bombers. Test pilots approaching it for the first time invariably asked if something that size could actually fly. Not only did it fly, it flew unlike anything else. At altitude, where the turbo supercharger fed sea-level air pressure to the engine, the P-47 was fast, reaching 433 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. In a dive, it was faster than anything in the sky, capable of exceeding 500 miles per hour in a full-power dive from altitude. But in a turning fight below 20,000 feet, it was hopeless. German fighters could turn inside it, climb away from it, and outmaneuver it at every altitude below 25,000 feet, which was exactly what Egon Mayer planned to exploit on April 8, 1943. Mayer led his Schwarm, a four-ship formation, into position 5,000 feet above and behind the American formation. His plan was textbook Luftwaffe doctrine developed over 3 years of combat. Dive from above, building tremendous speed. Open fire at 400 meters. Continue the diving pass through the formation. Use the speed from the dive to climb back to altitude before the Americans could react. At 11:47 a.m., Mayer rolled inverted and dove. His 3 wingmen followed, spaced perfectly, attacking from the American formation's 6 o'clock high position. Their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns were armed and ready. Target acquisition was easy. The American fighters were so large they couldn't be missed. Mayer's gun sight centered on the rearmost P-47. Range closed rapidly, 600 meters, 500, 400, fire. Mayer's cannon and machine guns hammered out a 2-second burst. He saw strikes on the American fighter's wing and fuselage. Good hits, hits that should cripple the aircraft. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Mayer flashed past, his speed exceeding 450 miles per hour in the dive. He pulled back on the stick, beginning his climb back to altitude. Behind him, his wingmen were firing, their tracers converging on American aircraft that should be falling in flames. None were falling. This was Mayer's first indication that something was wrong. Major Donald Blakesley, commanding the American formation from the 4th Fighter Group, had been a former RAF Eagle Squadron pilot who had transitioned to the P-47 just weeks earlier. He understood the Thunderbolt's weaknesses. He also understood its strengths. Bandits, 6 o'clock high. He called over the radio. Maintain formation. Don't try to turn with them. Let them come. This violated every fighter pilot's instinct. When attacked, you turned into the attack, forced a turning fight where skill and agility mattered. But Blakesley knew the P-47 couldn't turn with German fighters. Trying to dogfight FW-190s at this altitude was suicide. So he did something the Germans didn't expect. Nothing. The P-47 formation held course and speed. When Mayer's Schwarm flashed through them, firing, the American pilots simply absorbed the hits and maintained formation. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying wing position in Blakesley's formation, felt the impacts as 20mm shells struck his aircraft. The P-47 shuddered. Metal fragments flew past his canopy, but the engine kept running. The controls still responded. The aircraft kept flying. Johnson keyed his radio. "I'm hit. Aircraft is flyable. Staying in formation." Across the formation, other P-47 pilots reported similar damage. Hits that would have destroyed Spitfires or Hurricanes had barely degraded their aircraft's combat capability. This was the first demonstration of the P-47's most important characteristic. It was nearly impossible to shoot down quickly. Mayer, climbing back to altitude, couldn't understand what he was seeing. His attack had been perfect. His gunnery was accurate. He'd seen the hits. Yet the American formation was still intact, still flying, still heading for their target. He keyed his radio to his group commander. "Attacks are ineffective. The American fighters appear heavily armored. Recommend concentrated attacks with multiple aircraft." Oberstleutnant Walter Ossow, commanding JG-2 from his own FW-190, acknowledged. "Understood. All Schwarms. Concentrate on single targets. We will overwhelm them with numbers." 8 FW-190s positioned for simultaneous attack on the rear section of the American formation. They would focus their fire on 2 P-47s, 4 German fighters per target. Surely that much concentrated firepower would be decisive. At 11:52 a.m., 5 minutes into the engagement, 8 German fighters dove on 2 American P-47s. Lieutenant Harold Comstock and his wingman, Lieutenant William Cunningham, saw them coming. Lieutenant Comstock's radio crackled, "Break right! Break right!" This time the P-47 pilots responded, turning hard into the attack, not to dogfight, but to spoil the Germans' firing solution. What happened next surprised everyone, especially the German pilots. The P-47s, despite their massive weight, turned. Not as tightly as the FW-190s, but far more sharply than their appearance suggested. The massive wing loading, which should have made them sluggish, was partially offset by their tremendous power. More importantly, the P-47's structural strength allowed them to pull G-forces that would have torn the wings off lighter fighters. Comstock yanked his stick back and to the right, pulling 6 Gs. The P-47 groaned but held together. The German fighters, expecting to easily stay behind their targets, suddenly found the Americans turning inside their attack angle, not beating them in a turning fight, but forcing them to overshoot or break off their attacks. The engagement dissolved into a swirling furball, multiple aircraft in close proximity, all trying to gain firing position. This was exactly what P-47 doctrine said to avoid, but Comstock had made a critical decision. Better to fight at a disadvantage than to be shot down from behind without fighting back. His 850 caliber machine guns, loaded with 3,400 rounds of ammunition, gave him one advantage. He could fire continuously for 30 seconds without running dry. German fighters, with 120 to 200 rounds of cannon ammunition, had to make every burst count. Comstock triggered a long burst at an FW-190 that flashed across his nose. Tracers reached out across 400 yards. The combined firepower of 850 caliber guns, firing at 800 rounds per minute each, created a stream of lead that was nearly impossible to miss with once it reached the target. The FW-190 shuddered as multiple rounds struck its wings and fuselage. Pieces flew off. The German fighter rolled away, trailing smoke. Comstock didn't see it crash. In air combat, you rarely saw the final outcome. You fired, saw hits, and moved to the next threat. But German pilots observed something that would be reported in debriefs that evening. The American fighters' guns, dismissed as inferior to German cannon, were devastating when they connected. The volume of fire was unlike anything Luftwaffe pilots had experienced. Later analysis would reveal why. German cannon fired heavy explosive shells that could destroy an aircraft with a few hits, but fired slowly and carried limited ammunition. American 50 caliber machine guns fired smaller bullets, but fired far more of them. At convergence range, where all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected, a target faced 100 half-inch projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Aircraft caught in that cone of fire didn't just get hit, they got shredded. By 11:58 a.m., 12 minutes into the engagement, the tactical situation had evolved beyond German expectations. No American fighters had been shot down. Multiple P-47s showed battle damage, some severe, but all were still flying. 2 German fighters had been damaged seriously enough to break off combat and return to base. More disturbingly, the Americans hadn't broken formation and run. They were fighting. Mayer, reassessing the situation, made a critical observation that he would radio to his command immediately after breaking off. The new American fighter is extremely robust. Combat damage that would destroy one of our fighters merely degrades their performance. Their armament is heavy, though less accurate than our cannon. They fight aggressively despite being outnumbered. Recommend revised tactics focusing on deflection shooting to avoid their defensive fire. This report, filed at 12:30 p.m. on April 8, 1943, was the first German acknowledgement that the P-47 was not going to be an easy target. It would not be the last. The engagement concluded at 12:05 p.m. when the German fighters, running low on fuel and ammunition, broke off and returned to their bases in France. The P-47s, also low on fuel, turned for England. All 16 Thunderbolts returned to base. 3 required significant repairs for battle damage. 1, Lieutenant Johnson's aircraft, had 47 hits from cannon shells and machine gun fire. It was repaired overnight and flew the next day's mission. The German fighters returned to Beaumont-le-Roger airfield, missing 2 aircraft to crash landings from battle damage. The pilots survived, but their aircraft were total losses. The kill ratio was 0-0. Neither side had achieved a confirmed shoot-down in visual combat. But the psychological impact was entirely one-sided. American pilots landed excited, energized. They had fought the legendary Luftwaffe and survived. More than survived, they had fought effectively. Their combat reports emphasized the P-47's toughness. "The aircraft can take tremendous punishment," wrote Lieutenant Comstock. "I counted over 20 hits on my aircraft after landing. None penetrated critical systems. The armor works. The aircraft brings you home." German pilots landed confused and concerned. Their combat reports, filed throughout the afternoon and evening of April 8th, revealed growing unease. Lieutenant Werner Schwar, GG-2. "The new American fighter is unexpectedly robust. Multiple cannon hits showed no immediate effect. Their return fire is heavy. Recommend caution in engagement." Oberfeldwebel Josef Wormheller, GG-2. "American fighters absorb damage that should have been catastrophic. Their defensive fire is accurate enough at close range to pose serious threat. Suggest standoff attacks with cannon fire from beyond effective range of their machine guns." Hauptmann Kurt Buligan, GG-2. "Engaged multiple American fighters. Observed hits from 20 mm. Aircraft continued fighting. Their machine gun armament creates defensive zone difficult to penetrate. These are not easy targets." These reports reached Luftwaffe High Command by the evening of April 8, 1943. They were initially dismissed as excuses for failing to achieve decisive results, but more combat reports would arrive over the next 48 hours that would force a complete reassessment. April 9, 1943, the second day of intensive P-47 operations over occupied Europe. This time, 48 Thunderbolts from the 4th, 78th, and 56th Fighter Groups flew a sweep over Belgium and northern France. Their mission was to engage German fighters and draw them into combat. Luftwaffe High Command, eager to assess the new American fighters' capabilities, ordered multiple fighter groups to intercept. Over 100 German fighters, FW-190s and Bf-109s, rose to meet them. The resulting engagement, spread across 50 miles of Belgian sky, would become known among Luftwaffe pilots as the day we stopped laughing. At 10:15 a.m. over Ghent, Belgium, 24 FW-190s from JG-26 engaged a formation of 16 P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group. The formation was led by Major Gerhard Schopf, an experienced pilot with 40 victories. Schopf had read the combat reports from April 8th with skepticism. His squadron had been fighting since 1940. They understood air combat. If the new American fighters were tough, they would simply hit them harder. Schopf positioned his swarms for coordinated attack from multiple angles. The Americans would be unable to defend against simultaneous attacks from different vectors, standard Luftwaffe doctrine perfected over years of combat. At 10:18 a.m., Schopf led the attack. 24 FW-190s dove on 16 P-47s from 3 different directions. Cannon and machine gun fire converged on the American formation. At least a dozen P-47s were hit in the initial pass. None fell. Major Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group from his own P-47, made a decision that would become standard doctrine for P-47 pilots. Rather than turning to dogfight, which would play to German advantages, he led his formation into a dive. The P-47s nosed over and accelerated downward, using their tremendous weight and powerful engines to build speed the German fighters couldn't match. At 25,000 feet, the P-47s were doing 400 mph and accelerating. At 15,000 feet, they were approaching 550 mph, faster than any German fighter could achieve in level flight. The German fighters, attempting to follow, watched in disbelief as the American fighters simply pulled away, not through superior speed and level flight, but through superior dive performance. Schopf, diving after the Americans, pulled out at 10,000 feet as his aircraft began to buffet with the onset of compressibility. The P-47s continued diving, their massive structural strength allowing them to operate at speeds where German fighters encountered control problems. At 5,000 feet, Zemke leveled out and began a climbing turn back to altitude. The P-47's powerful engine and excellent energy retention meant that speed from the dive could be converted to altitude. Within minutes, the American formation was back at 20,000 feet, repositioned and ready to re-engage. The German fighters, having exhausted their energy in the dive, were below them and unable to quickly regain altitude. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots found themselves at a disadvantage against American fighters. Zemke keyed his radio. "This is Zemke. We have altitude advantage. Individual swarms select targets. Let's go to work." What followed was the first large-scale demonstration of the P-47's true tactical potential. Rather than dogfighting at medium altitude, where German fighters held every advantage, the Thunderbolts fought vertically. They dove from altitude, building tremendous speed, made a single firing pass, then used their energy to zoom back to altitude. German fighters attempting to follow found themselves in a losing game. They couldn't catch the P-47s in the dive, they couldn't match their zoom climb, and if they tried to position for their own dive attacks, the Americans simply dove away, refusing to fight on German terms. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying his second combat mission, shot down his first German fighter that morning using these tactics. Johnson spotted a lone Bf-109 at 18,000 feet, unaware of the P-47s above. Johnson rolled inverted and dove, building speed to 480 miles per hour. At 500 yards, he opened fire. 8 .50 caliber guns converged on the German fighter. The first burst missed, tracers passing ahead of the target. Johnson adjusted, walking his fire back. The second burst struck the Bf-109's tail section. The third burst hit the fuselage and left wing. The Messerschmitt's wing folded upward, failed structurally, and separated from the aircraft. The fuselage tumbled, the pilot attempting to bail out but unable to escape before the aircraft entered a flat spin. Johnson didn't watch it hit the ground. He pulled back on his stick and converted his remaining speed to altitude, climbing back to 22,000 feet where he rejoined his formation. The entire attack, from initial dive to return to altitude, had taken 90 seconds. Johnson's combat report, filed that afternoon, captured the essence of P-47 tactics that would be refined over the coming months. Dove on target from 25,000 feet. Reached approximately 480 miles per hour, opened fire at 500 yards, observed hits, target destroyed, used energy from dive to climb back to altitude, German fighters below unable to interfere. Recommend this as standard tactic. By noon on April 9th, across multiple engagements over Belgium and France, P-47 pilots had achieved 7 confirmed kills for 2 losses. This 3.5-to-1 ratio was respectable, but the numbers didn't tell the full story. The Americans lost 2 fighters to structural failure during high-speed dives, not to German fire. The Germans lost 7 fighters to American guns, with another 4 damaged severely enough to be written off after crash landings. More significantly, the engagement had demonstrated that the P-47, when properly employed, could dominate German fighters at high altitude. The Luftwaffe's tactical advantage at medium and low altitude was meaningless if the Americans refused to fight there. German combat reports from April 9th reflected growing concern. Schopfel's report to JG-26 headquarters was particularly alarming. American fighters demonstrate superior performance above 20,000 feet. Their dive speed exceeds anything we can achieve. They refuse close combat, preferring to attack from altitude in high-speed passes. Our standard tactics are ineffective. Recommend revised approach, focusing on forcing them to low altitude where our performance advantages can be exploited. But forcing P-47s to low altitude proved nearly impossible. The American fighters, with their powerful engines and efficient turbosuperchargers, could maintain high altitude indefinitely. German fighters, straining at maximum power at 25,000 feet, couldn't sustain combat at those altitudes. They had to choose between abandoning the high-altitude battle or burning fuel at rates that limited their combat time to minutes. Oberst Josef Priller, commanding JG-26, filed a report to Luftwaffe High Command on the evening of April 9th that captured the emerging German assessment. The American P-47 represents a significant development in enemy fighter capability. While inferior in turning combat, the aircraft's high-altitude performance, dive speed, and structural strength make it a formidable opponent when properly employed by skilled pilots. Current tactics developed against British fighters are inadequate. We require new approach to counter this threat. This report reached Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, on April 10th. Göring's response, recorded in Luftwaffe command diaries, reflected his characteristic denial of unwelcome realities. American fighters remain inferior to German equipment. Reports suggesting otherwise reflect inadequate aggression by our pilots. Units will press attacks with determination and destroy enemy fighters regardless of their alleged robustness. This response, dismissing frontline combat experience in favor of ideological certainty, would prove catastrophic as the air war evolved. But German fighters facing P-47s didn't have the luxury of denial. They had to develop tactics that worked or die. April 10, 1943. 48 hours since the P-47's first deep penetration mission. The previous 2 days had seen 5 major engagements and dozens of smaller clashes between Thunderbolts and German fighters. Luftwaffe intelligence had compiled combat reports from over 150 pilots who had engaged P-47s. The analysis, completed on the morning of April 10th and distributed to fighter units that afternoon, represented the first comprehensive German assessment of the American fighter. Major Heinz Baer, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces assigned to evaluate American fighter capabilities, wrote the summary. His conclusions would shape German tactics for the remainder of the war. The Republic P-47 represents a different approach to fighter design than European aircraft. It prioritizes altitude performance, structural strength, and firepower over maneuverability and rate of climb. Assessment of capabilities. Altitude performance, excellent above 25,000 feet. Superior to all German fighters at 30,000 feet and above. Dive performance, exceptional. Can exceed 500 miles per hour in dive, surpassing all Luftwaffe fighters. Can use dive speed to escape any engagement. Structural strength, outstanding. Can absorb battle damage that would destroy 2 or 3 German fighters. Multiple confirmed instances of aircraft surviving 20-plus cannon hits. Armament, 8 50 caliber machine guns provide heavy volume of fire. While individual bullets less destructive than cannon shells, the combined weight of fire is devastating at convergence range. Ammunition capacity allows sustained firing. Pilot protection, extensive armor plate and bulletproof glass. Pilot casualties notably lower than aircraft damage would suggest. Turning combat, poor below 20,000 feet. Inferior to FW-190 and BF-110 at all altitudes in sustained turning combat. Rate of climb, adequate at altitude, poor near ground. Can be outclimbed by German fighters below 15,000 feet. Recommended tactics. Avoid engagement above 25,000 feet, where aircraft has performance advantage. Force combat to low altitude through attacks on bombers they escort. When engagement unavoidable, use hit-and-run attacks rather than sustained combat. Attack from the front quarter, where their armor is concentrated, avoiding the cone of fire from 8 guns. Multiple aircraft must engage simultaneously to overwhelm defensive fire. Do not pursue in dives. They can outdive any Luftwaffe fighter. Do not engage in extended combat. They have ammunition and fuel for sustained operations we cannot match. Warning to all pilots. This aircraft must be treated as serious threat despite ungainly appearance. Units that dismiss it as inferior will suffer casualties. first impression of vulnerability is deceptive. The P-47 is a weapon system designed for industrial warfare, emphasizing survivability and sustainability over tactical elegance. It is effective within its design parameters. This assessment, distributed on April 10, 1943, marked the end of German laughter. The P-47 was no longer a joke. It was a threat that required respect and new tactics. But the document revealed something more significant than tactical analysis. It showed that German pilots understood they were facing a different type of warfare than they had trained for. The P-47 wasn't trying to be a better dogfighter. It was designed to overwhelm through firepower and survivability, to win through attrition rather than elegance. This was American industrial warfare made physical. The Germans could understand it intellectually, but they couldn't match it materially. The Luftwaffe would continue developing tactics to counter the P-47 with varying success. But the fundamental equation couldn't be changed. America was building P-47s faster than Germany could shoot them down, and training pilots faster than the Luftwaffe could kill them. Every P-47 destroyed was replaced within days. Every German fighter destroyed was increasingly difficult to replace. The 48 hours from April 8 to April 10, 1943, marked the beginning of this calculation becoming visible. German pilots had learned that American fighters were tougher, better armed, and more capable than intelligence had suggested. They had learned that American pilots, while inexperienced, were learning rapidly and fighting aggressively. Most importantly, they had learned that the air war over Europe was entering a new phase where German tactical superiority would be insufficient to counter American material superiority. The laughter had stopped. The dying would accelerate. The 48 hours when German pilots stopped laughing at the P-47 were the 48 hours when the Luftwaffe began its long defeat in the skies over Western Europe, not through a single catastrophic battle, but through the grinding realization that they were fighting enemies who could absorb losses and continue fighting, while every German loss moved closer to collapse. The P-47 would go on to become one of the war's most successful fighters, with over 15,000 built. It would destroy more German aircraft in air combat than any other American fighter type in Europe. It would become the most effective fighter bomber in the Allied arsenal, destroying thousands of German vehicles, trains, and positions. But its greatest impact was psychological. From April 10, 1943 onward, German pilots knew that American fighters were not easy prey. They knew that engaging Thunderbolts meant facing aircraft that could take punishment and return devastating fire. They knew that the air war was no longer a game of tactical skill alone, but an industrial grinding match where American capacity would eventually overwhelm German capability. Egon Mayer, who had laughed at the P-47s on April 8, would not laugh again. He would file increasingly concerned combat reports over the following months, noting American numerical superiority, improved tactics, and relentless pressure. On March 2, 1944, 11 months after his first encounter with P-47s, Mayer would engage a formation of Thunderbolts over Montmedy, France. 850 caliber machine guns would converge on his FW-190. The aircraft would disintegrate in mid-air. Mayer, who had survived over 350 combat missions and achieved 102 victories, would die instantly, killed by the weapon he had once dismissed as a flying milk bottle. His death exemplified the trajectory of the air war. German aces with years of experience were being killed by American pilots flying aircraft that emphasized survivability and firepower over dogfighting elegance. Individual skill mattered less than systematic application of overwhelming force. The last laugh belonged to the fat, ungainly fighter that had looked so ridiculous on April 8, 1943. The P-47 Thunderbolt would have the last word in every engagement, delivered by 850 caliber machine guns that tore German fighters from the sky and proved that in industrial warfare, the side that can build the most robust, most heavily armed, most reliable weapons will eventually overwhelm tactical brilliance. The Germans stopped laughing in 48 hours. They would spend the next 2 years dying. The individual stories from those first 48 hours reveal the human dimension behind the tactical revolution. American pilots who had been told their aircraft was too heavy, too slow, and too unwieldy discovered that proper tactics could turn apparent weaknesses into devastating strengths. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemka, who commanded the 56th Fighter Group through those first missions, became the leading advocate for the P-47 within the Army Air Forces. His after-action reports from April 8–10, 1943 documented not just tactical success, but a philosophical approach to air combat that would revolutionize American fighter doctrine. The P-47 cannot dogfight with German fighters at medium altitude, Zemka wrote on April 11. Attempting to do so will result in losses we cannot sustain. However, the P-47 can dominate the high-altitude battlespace through superior performance above 25,000 feet. It can engage at will through dive attacks that German fighters cannot counter. It can survive battle damage that would destroy lighter fighters. It can sustain operations longer than German fighters due to superior fuel capacity and ammunition load. Most importantly, it can be produced in quantities that make tactical losses strategically irrelevant. We must fight the P-47's war, not the Luftwaffe's war. We must force them to fight on our terms at our altitude, where our advantages overwhelm their skill. This philosophy, born in those first 48 hours of combat, would become doctrine for American fighter operations in Europe. The P-47 groups would not try to out-dogfight German aces. They would use altitude, speed, and firepower to impose American-style industrial warfare on the tactical level. The transformation of American fighter tactics between April 8 and 10, 1943, was remarkably rapid. On April 8, American pilots had flown in tight formations, maintained discipline, but fought defensively when engaged. By April 10, they were aggressively hunting German fighters, using coordinated dive attacks from altitude and demonstrating confidence that stunned Luftwaffe observers. Oberst Josef Priller, watching the April 10 engagements from the ground at his command post, recorded his observations in his personal diary. The Americans are learning faster than we anticipated. On their first missions, they were cautious, maintaining tight formations, avoiding extended combat. Today they attacked aggressively, used their aircraft's dive performance effectively, and demonstrated coordination between flights. Their inexperience shows in individual tactics, but their systematic approach and willingness to learn rapidly based on combat experience faster than we can adapt is concerning. We are not fighting individual American pilots. We are fighting the American training system, which produces adequate pilots in unlimited quantities and improves their doctrine based on combat experience faster than we can adapt. This is more dangerous than individual excellence. Excellence can be countered by skill. Systematic improvement backed by unlimited resources cannot be countered by anything except equal resources, which we lack. Priller's assessment captured the essential difference between German and American approaches to air warfare. The Luftwaffe emphasized individual pilot skill, ace culture, and tactical brilliance. The Americans emphasized systematic doctrine, coordinated tactics, and industrial capacity to sustain losses while improving. In a short war, the German approach might have prevailed. In a long war of attrition, the American approach was unbeatable. The 48 hours of April 8–10, 1943 didn't just introduce the P-47 to combat, they introduced a new model of air warfare where the most important factors were not individual skill or aircraft performance in specific parameters, but systematic application of resources and willingness to learn from experience. German pilots maintained individual superiority in dogfighting skill throughout the war. They never regained the psychological advantage they lost in those 48 hours when the P-47 demonstrated that American fighters could take everything the Luftwaffe could deliver and still fight back effectively. The technical aspects of the P-47's performance in those first 48 hours were analyzed exhaustively by both sides. American engineers studied battle damage reports to understand how their armor schemes and structural design were performing. German intelligence analyzed gun camera footage and pilot reports to identify vulnerabilities they could exploit. The American analysis revealed that the P-47's design philosophy was sound. The extensive armor protection, 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, half-inch bulletproof glass, and armored deflection plates around critical systems was stopping or deflecting the majority of German fire. Even when shells penetrated, the aircraft's redundant systems and robust structure allowed continued operation. The massive engine, which many had criticized as too large and draggy for a fighter, proved nearly impossible to stop with single hits. Unlike inline liquid-cooled engines that would seize immediately if coolant leaked, the air-cooled R-2800 could run with multiple cylinders damaged. There were documented cases of P-47s returning to base with 3 or 4 cylinders completely destroyed by cannon fire, the engine still producing enough power to maintain flight. The massive structure, which made the aircraft heavy, also made it incredibly strong. The P-47 could pull high-G maneuvers that would tear the wings off lighter fighters. It could survive dives to speeds approaching the sound barrier. It could absorb combat damage that would doom other aircraft. This structural strength had a cost in performance at low altitude. That cost was acceptable given the survivability advantage. German analysis, by contrast, revealed concerning vulnerabilities in their own fighter designs. The FW-190 and Bf-110, while agile and fast, were fragile. A single well-placed burst from 50 caliber guns could destroy them. Their liquid cooling systems were vulnerable to even minor damage. Their lightweight construction, while enabling superior dogfighting performance, meant they couldn't absorb punishment. Luftwaffe technical reports from mid-April 1943 recommended increased armor protection and more robust construction for future fighters. But these changes would add weight, reducing the very agility that made German fighters competitive. There was no easy solution. You could have a light, agile fighter that was vulnerable, or a tough, survivable fighter that was heavy. The Americans had chosen survivability. The Germans, by 1943, lacked the industrial capacity to build enough of either type. The psychological impact of those first 48 hours extended far beyond the pilots who flew the missions. Word spread through the Luftwaffe fighter force that the American P-47s were not to be underestimated. Veteran pilots who had dismissed them as easy targets revised their assessments. New pilots were warned that engaging Thunderbolts required caution and respect. This psychological shift from contempt to respect fundamentally changed the air war's dynamic. When German pilots had felt superior to their opponents, they attacked aggressively and took risks. When they respected their opponents' capabilities, they became cautious, less willing to press attacks, more concerned with survival than victory. This caution, multiplied across hundreds of pilots, reduced Luftwaffe effectiveness more than any tactical defeat could. The Americans, conversely, gained confidence from those first engagements. They had faced the legendary Luftwaffe and not just survived, but fought effectively. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics, willingness to engage at unfavorable odds, and belief that their aircraft and training would see them through. Major Don Blakesley, who had led the first P-47 combat missions, captured this transformation in a letter to his former RAF squadron mates on April 12, 1943. The Thunderbolt is not a Spitfire. It doesn't turn like a Spit, doesn't climb like a Spit, doesn't feel like a Spit, but it does things the Spit can't do. It goes faster in a dive than anything I've ever flown. It takes punishment that would destroy 3 Spits. It has more guns than a bomber. And most importantly, it brings you home. I've seen ships come back with damage that should have killed the pilot. The Jerry puts 20 millimeters through the wings, through the tail, through the fuselage. The aircraft keeps flying. That's worth more than any amount of maneuverability. I can teach a man to dive and zoom in a week. I can't bring dead pilots back from missions they flew in aircraft that couldn't protect them. Blakesley's assessment reflected the emerging American fighter pilot culture. They weren't trying to be knights of the air, engaging in honorable duels with worthy opponents. They were trying to complete their missions, kill enemy fighters, protect bombers, and go home alive. The P-47, for all its aesthetic shortcomings, enabled this practical approach to air combat better than any fighter America had fielded to that point. The 48 hours also revealed something about American institutional capacity to learn and adapt. The Army Air Forces had invested heavily in systematic analysis of combat performance. Every mission generated detailed reports. Pilots were debriefed extensively. Gun camera footage was analyzed frame by frame. Battle damage was photographed and studied. This systematic approach to learning meant that lessons from April 8-10 were documented, distributed, and incorporated into training and tactics within weeks. German institutional learning, while still functioning in April 1943, was less systematic and more reliant on individual unit initiatives. The Luftwaffe's centralized command structure meant that tactical innovations had to flow up the chain of command, be approved, and then flow back down. This took time and meant that lessons learned in one unit might not reach others for months. The Americans, with their more decentralized command structure and emphasis on standardized doctrine, could disseminate lessons across the entire force rapidly. A tactic developed by the 56th Fighter Group on April 9th could be taught to the 4th Fighter Group by April 12th. This organizational advantage, combined with superior industrial capacity, meant that American forces improved continuously while German forces stagnated or declined. The impact on German fighter pilot morale was subtle but significant. Luftwaffe fighter pilots in early 1943 still believed they were the world's best fighter force. They had victories on every front. They had legendary aces. They had aircraft they believed superior to Allied equivalents. The P-47's appearance and performance challenged this confidence. If American fighters, ugly and ungainly as they were, could fight effectively, what did that say about German superiority? If Americans could absorb the losses and keep coming, what did that say about the war's outcome? These questions, unspoken in official reports but present in private conversations and diaries, began eroding the psychological foundation of German fighter operations. By late April 1943, Luftwaffe fighter pilots were operating under stresses that would only intensify. They faced increasing numbers of American heavy bombers, each one bristling with defensive guns. They faced growing numbers of escort fighters, P-47s that could reach deeper into Germany with each passing month as external fuel tanks increased their range. They faced relentless pressure, flying multiple missions daily with decreasing rest periods between operations. The 48 hours of April 8-10 marked the beginning of this grind. The Luftwaffe fighter force in April 1943 numbered approximately 1,500 aircraft in the West, with roughly 800 serviceable at any time. Pilot strength was adequate, with experienced veterans available to train new pilots. Fuel was sufficient for training and operations. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe would have over 3,000 fighters available but lacked fuel to fly them and pilots trained to fly them effectively. The journey from adequacy to collapse began with battles like those first P-47 engagements where German pilots learned they were facing opponents they could no longer dominate. The strategic implications of the P-47's successful combat debut extended beyond tactical air combat. American strategic planning had assumed that daylight bombing raids deep into Germany would require fighter escort to be sustainable. The B-17 and B-24 bombers, while heavily armed, were vulnerable to determined fighter attacks. Without escort, losses would be prohibitive. The P-47, by proving it could fight effectively against German fighters and survive the combat environment, validated the feasibility of escorted daylight bombing. This meant the strategic air campaign against Germany could continue and expand. German war production, transportation networks, and oil supplies would face increasing attacks that would systematically degrade the Wehrmacht's ability to fight. The P-47's combat debut thus had strategic consequences far beyond the air-to-air engagements themselves. It enabled a campaign that would destroy Germany's capacity to wage war. Oberst Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, commanding all Luftwaffe fighter forces, understood these implications by mid-April 1943. His diary entries from April 15th revealed his assessment. The American P-47 represents more than a new fighter type. It represents American capacity to solve problems through industrial means. They needed high-altitude escort fighters. They designed one emphasizing survivability and firepower over elegance. They are producing it in quantities we cannot match. They are training pilots to fly it in numbers we cannot equal. Most importantly, they are learning from combat experience and improving their tactics faster than we can adapt. This is not a tactical problem. This is a strategic problem. We are fighting American industry, and we lack the resources to win that fight. Galland's assessment was prescient but futile. He lacked authority to change German strategy or to secure the resources needed to match American fighter production. He could only watch as his fighter force was slowly ground down by attrition it couldn't sustain. The 48 hours when German pilots stopped laughing at the P-47 were also the 48 hours when perceptive German commanders began to understand that the air war was lost. Not lost in April 1943, the Luftwaffe would fight effectively for another year, but lost strategically, as American industrial capacity could produce fighters faster than Germany could destroy them and train pilots faster than Germany could kill them. The human cost of this grinding attrition was terrible on both sides. American fighter pilots faced mortality rates that rivaled bomber crews. Of the pilots who flew those first P-47 missions in April 1943, fewer than half would survive their combat tours. Some were shot down by German fighters, some fell to flak, some died in accidents, some simply vanished, their fates unknown. German fighter pilots faced even worse odds. Of the Luftwaffe fighter pilots who flew against P-47s in April 1943, the majority would be dead within 18 months. The most skilled were targeted deliberately by Allied tactics designed to kill aces. The least skilled were killed by the overwhelming numbers and firepower they faced. Even average pilots found survival increasingly unlikely as American numerical superiority grew. The 48 hours examined here were just the beginning of this terrible arithmetic. Every week brought more American fighters, better trained American pilots, improved American tactics. Every week saw fewer German fighters, less experienced German pilots, reduced German fuel for training and operations. Egon Mayer, who had laughed at the P-47s on April 8, 1943, symbolized the trajectory of the Luftwaffe fighter force. He was skilled, experienced, dedicated. He flew constantly, achieved victories, survived when others died. But on March 2, 1944, his skill and experience were insufficient against the systematic application of American airpower. A P-47 formation, one of hundreds operating that day, engaged his flight. 8 50-caliber machine guns converged on his aircraft. The FW-190, despite his skill in flying it, could not survive that concentration of fire. Mayer died instantly when his aircraft disintegrated. His death illustrated the fundamental imbalance. American losses could be replaced, German losses, especially of experienced pilots, could not. Each German ace killed was a permanent loss of capability. Each American pilot killed was tragic but strategically replaceable. This cold arithmetic determined the air war's outcome more than any individual battle. The P-47 was the weapon that made this arithmetic visible. It was tough enough to bring pilots home. It had enough firepower to kill when it hit. It could be produced in numbers that made German kill ratios irrelevant. If America lost 2 P-47s for every German fighter destroyed, America still won, because it could build 4 new P-47s while Germany couldn't replace the lost fighter. By April 10, 1943, 48 hours after the first deep penetration mission, German intelligence had compiled enough data to understand what they faced. The P-47 wasn't invincible. It could be shot down. German pilots would achieve thousands of kills against Thunderbolts over the next 2 years. But it was tough enough and numerous enough that shooting them down didn't matter strategically. America would keep building them. American pilots would keep flying them. The Luftwaffe would keep bleeding. The final irony of those 48 hours was that the German pilots' initial assessment was partially correct. The P-47 was ungainly. It was too heavy. It couldn't dogfight effectively at medium altitude. It did look like a flying milk bottle compared to sleek German fighters. But none of that mattered. The P-47 wasn't designed to win dogfights. It was designed to win a war of attrition through survivability, firepower, and industrial production capacity. Judged by those criteria, it was one of the most successful fighters of World War II. The Germans laughed at its appearance on April 8th. By April 10th, the laughter had stopped, replaced by wary respect and growing concern. Over the next 2 years, that concern would become fear as the sky filled with Thunderbolts, as German fighters fell in increasing numbers, as it became clear that the air war was lost. The P-47 didn't win the air war alone. The P-51 Mustang would take over long-range escort duties. The P-38 Lightning would serve in multiple theaters. Tactical and strategic factors beyond fighter combat would determine the war's outcome, but the P-47's 48-hour combat debut marked a turning point. It was the moment when German fighter superiority, taken for granted since 1939, became contestable, when American fighters could meet German fighters and fight effectively, when industrial warfare's mathematics began overwhelming tactical brilliance. The Germans stopped laughing in those 48 hours. They would spend the next 24 months learning that the joke had always been on them. They had dismissed American air power as inferior, American pilots as inexperienced, American equipment as inadequate. The P-47 proved all those assumptions wrong. It wasn't the best dogfighter. It didn't need to be. It was the most survivable, most heavily armed, most reliable fighter in the theater. In a war of attrition, those qualities mattered more than agility or climb rate. The legacy of those 48 hours extended far beyond World War II. The lessons learned, that survivability and firepower could compensate for lack of maneuverability, that industrial capacity could overcome tactical deficiencies, that systematic learning could beat individual brilliance, would shape American military doctrine for generations. The P-47 became the template for American tactical fighters: big, tough, heavily armed, reliable. These characteristics would appear in the F-84, the F-100, the F-4 Phantom, and subsequent American fighters. The philosophy that pilot survivability mattered more than aircraft performance in specific parameters would become doctrine. The understanding that wars of attrition favored the side with superior industrial capacity and institutional learning would shape American strategic planning through the Cold War and beyond. All of this traced back to April 8-10, 1943, when a fat, ungainly fighter that looked like it couldn't possibly compete with sleek German aircraft proved that appearance meant nothing, that performance in combat mattered more than performance on paper, that wars are won by the side that can sustain operations longest, not the side with the most elegant equipment. The Germans stopped laughing in 48 hours. The P-47 Thunderbolt had the last laugh, delivered by 850 caliber machine guns that proved American industrial warfare could overwhelm any opponent, no matter how skilled, no matter how experienced, no matter how tactically brilliant. The lesson was simple and brutal. In modern warfare, the side that can build the most survivable weapons, train adequate pilots in massive numbers, and sustain operations through industrial capacity will defeat the side that relies on individual excellence and tactical superiority. The Luftwaffe learned this lesson over 48 hours in April 1943. They would spend the next 2 years dying from it. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the flying milk bottle that German pilots had laughed at, became the weapon that helped destroy German air superiority and prove that in industrial warfare, the last laugh always belongs to the side with the most factories, the most pilots, and the most bullets.